My name is James Earl Brown. I was born January 5th, 1925 in Simpson County, Mississippi.
All right. And what about your how many siblings did you have?
There was five in the family. I'm the second oldest. I had three sisters and one brother.
And
I'm the second oldest one.
your parents?
My parents, my dad's name was James Tim Brown. My mother's maiden name was Runnels, Runnels, and her father's name was Felix, and her mother's name was Betty. And they had 8 children in their family.
Hmm.
My mother was about the fourth one from the top.
And what did they do?
Farmers. My grandfather, her father, was a sharecropper farmer. In other words, he farmed land that belonged to a merchant.
So what was it like growing up on a farm?
Well, that's all I knew until I was 17 years old. But my dad had bought 40 acres. They already had a house and barn and fences around the fields. There was about 20 acres in cultivation. The rest of it was wooded area and pasture land. He bought that from his dad. His dad had sold his homestead that he raised his family on in another county, about 40 miles from there. And he had bought that place in 1917. And my dad was in the Army in World War I. And he was only in for a very short time before the war ended, and he was still wanting to travel, so he joined the Navy for a 2-year hitch because the Navy had dropped their requirements down to you could get a 2-year hitch at that time because they was losing so many that was getting discharged after World War I was over. So he put a 2-year hitch in the Navy. And when he come out in 1920 or 21, he bought that place from his father. He paid $1,800 for 40 acres and a house and a barn and of course an outhouse because we didn't have any electricity or any running water. But he bought that from his dad, and that's where all of us children was born and raised right there.
And how big was that house that you all lived in?
700 square feet.
And what was a typical day like, say when you were like 12, like a school-aged child? What was a typical day for you?
Walked to school. We lived about a mile from school on a dirt road. Well, actually it was a gravel road. We walked to school, and then when we came home in the afternoon, there was always some kind of a chores for children that was raised on the farm to do when they come home from school.
Such as?
Depending upon what time of year it was, if it's in the part of the year where you're cultivating a crop, mostly it was using a hoe, chopping the weeds and grass out of the crops. Because we'd always scrape the weeds and grass out of the crop before my dad would come along with a plow to make another furrow and cover that which we hoed out. And if it was in the fall of the year when it's cotton picking time, we picked cotton. And whatever there was to be done, gathering potatoes, gathering corn, whatever it was.
Do you have any animals to take care of?
We always had one milk cow and another standby. In other words, we usually have 2 cows. But we didn't need more than one to supply enough milk for the family. We always had another one just in case. But usually they try to get them rotated where that when one would go dry, getting ready for the breeding season, the other one would be coming along to give milk. And then when we breed the cow, when she come in season, if it was a bull calf, we sold it. Or we'd let someone butcher it and just keep part of the meat. and pay him for him getting part of the meat for butchering it. We raised our own hogs. We had no refrigeration, so we had a smokehouse. So when we would butcher the hogs, my dad would cut them up. He'd hang the shoulders and the hams up in the smokehouse as a dirt floor, the vent to let the smoke out. Build a fire with wood on the floor, dirt floor, underneath the racks where the meat was hanging. You smoke those hams and shoulders. But the middlings, they called it, where you make the siding, the bacon and so forth out of it. Cut that up in strips, put it in boxes, put a layer of meat and then a layer of salt, and continue like that. A layer of meat and a layer of salt. And you leave it there, that would preserve it. And the hams and the shoulders, when they were hanging up there with the heat underneath them, it would cause them to become to oozing a little moisture out of them. My mother would take a paintbrush and some clay and vinegar, and I don't remember what else she put with it, and make a mud paste out of it. And she would paste those while they were hot and sweaty, and then let them smoke some more. And then you ended up with them smoke cured with a crust on it. We get ready to cook a roast or something like that. She'd go out, take one of those down, cut off what she wanted off of it, take it in the kitchen, and leave the rest of it hang there until she wanted some more. We also made sausage out of the intestines of the hog. We would wash them out, turn them inside out, and have a long tube. Had a meat grinder that you have operated by hand, clamp it onto a table, cut this meat up in little blocks, poke it down through the meat grinder, crank it around, and you grind this meat up and extrude it out. You stretch that gut over the end of it, extrude it into it, and keep squeezing it down. And when you get it down to the end of it, where 6 inches of the end, you tie a knot in it. And then you make another one, and another one, and another one, right on up the full length of that. Link sausage. We also hang those up in the smokehouse and smoke those.
You said you were there until you were 17. What did you do after when you turned 17?
Well, times was hard. This was in the Big Depression. And of course, people like us on the farm, we raised everything we ate. Big gardens, corn, grind our own. Well, actually, we had to shell the corn off the cob, take it to the grits mill in town, and get it ground in the cornmeal. Well, we bought flour already processed and in bags from the store in town. But flour and processed sugar and some spices is about the only thing we had to buy. Baking soda and vinegar and stuff. Some of the staple goods like that we had to buy because we couldn't grow that.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did have to grow, now like to get the cornmeal ground, you had to let the miller take a toll out of your corn. You'd say you take a bushel of corn up there, he would take a certain weight out of that for his portion for grinding the rest of it for you. And that's the way we got our cornmeal. My mother made the cornbread out of that. We had our own chickens, we had our own eggs from the chickens we raised, kept chickens running loose on the yard. And we had our own vegetable gardens and potato patches in the field, sweet potatoes and Irish potatoes. We grew vegetables of all kinds. My mother would can the vegetables in fruit jars. She had a pressure cooker in her later year. Well, when I was up probably adolescent, she bought a pressure cooker that she could pressure cook these vegetables that she was canning in that. Well, we had to fire the stove with wood, with a wood burning stove. And the only way we could heat the house was put a fire in the fireplace. That's the only way we had heating the house in the wintertime. But year round, we had to fire the cook stove with wood. and we always had to cut our own wood. Me being the oldest boy in the family, from the time I was old enough and big enough to help my dad cut wood, every time he didn't have something he had to do that took priority, we would go and cut wood. We kept a big wood pile, kept it rotating where we'd always have dry wood, and store it out of the rain and weather so that it would remain dry even after it was dried from being cut down. But we had to rotate it for that we would always have dry wood. And for what they call lighter fluid and quick lighter, it would be this fat pine that had been topped and left to lay on the ground years before that in the area which was virgin pine timbers that had been cleared back in the turn of the century. And the tops of the trees, they didn't have any use for them then, so they just cut the tops off the big pines and leave them lay. You could go out in the wooded areas, and you could find this, they called it fat lighter. It was real fat pine. All the sap had rotted off of it. And you could make splinters out of that, and you could just strike a match and stick it to it, and there's light right away. So we had a big pile of that to start fires with, and then put the wood on it after you got that started.
So sorry. Why did you end up leaving the farm?
Well, like I say, it's natural for all boys to want to leave home, see another part of the world, or do something different. I think that was just our trend. Mm-hmm. And back in the 30s, I think it was 1932, when President Franklin Roosevelt started what they called the Civil Conservation Corps, for short, CCC. And that was in order to help families where the boys were getting grown up. Most of them didn't finish high school, and there was no jobs. So he started that Civil Conservation Corps, and it was several things to be accomplished through that. It was to prevent soil erosions, was one of the things. And in the areas where they needed to cut fire trails, in case for firefighters to go in and fight forest fires, they could do things like that. There was a lot of the things that they did. They built state parks. And if anybody studied history, they'd know what all the Civil Conservation Corps did. But they paid these CC boys, they called them. You could go in when you're 17 years old. And they paid them $30 a month. Of course, they got their room and board and clothing and medical care. $22 of that went home to the parents, and the CC boy got $7 a month for himself. But now, like my folks, I said, now don't you splurge that $7. Don't spend any more than you have to, because we need it, you know. So, but when I was 17, that was in January 1942. I was in the 10th grade that year. My mom and dad allowed for me to drop out of school, which I was glad to do, and go into CCC camps. So I went into CCC camps, and after going through a training session in the town of Laurel, Mississippi, about 40 miles east of where we lived, I was sent to Coos Bay, Oregon, by a troop train. Sent a bunch of us CC boys to Coos Bay, Oregon. It was called Marshfield then. And they had a camp out in the woods, and their job was cutting fire trails. But since I had taken typing in high school, they wanted somebody to work in the office of the educational advisor, they called it. But all my job would be doing then, it was typing up stuff that this educational advisor wanted me to type up for classes that they were holding for the boys, because they were holding classes for them. So it's sort of mandatory that you go to the class. Well, I was getting to go to the class, plus I had already typed up the stuff that was being studied. But I didn't like that. I would have rather been out in the woods cutting fire trails. But I couldn't do that. So I'd made friends with a guy that was 24 years old at that time and had been in the Army and had gotten out. I don't know if he was dishonorably discharged or what. And he was from this town of Laurel, Mississippi, 40 miles from where I was, near a little town by the name of McGee, Mississippi. It's 40 miles from McGee to Laurel. So he talked me into, they called it going over the hill from the CCCs. Of course, everyone that was in the CCCs knew that it wasn't military. It was run in a military way. It was regimented, but it was not considered a military service. And they knew that there was no penalty for deserting. So me being young and foolish, me being only 17 and him being 24, we went over the hill. We only went about a day's journey from there down to Rockport, California. Maybe a day and night. I think the next day sometime we was in Rockport, California. Before we got into Rockport, we was hitchhiking. And the man gave us a ride and he was going to his job in Rockport, California. Rockport is right out on the coast, north of Ukiah. And he was working at a big sawmill there, but named Rockport Redwood Lumber Company. And he said we could get a job out there if we wanted a job. He said he would take us out. He knew they were hiring. He would take us out to the employment office. The lumber company owned the little town. They owned the buildings that was there. The people that worked for the milling company lived there at the milling town. And he said that he was moving from Eureka to there, but his family was still in Eureka because he was going to leave them there until his children get through that school session. I think this was probably, I don't remember sure what month it was, but school was still going on. He didn't want to move them down till school was out. And he said until then, this guy, Irby, and I could live there with him. Incidentally, this guy made friends with us because he was from Mississippi originally, and Irby and I being from Mississippi, that's the reason he kind of felt sorry for us, I guess. So that worked out fine. I stayed there, I think it was 3 months working there, and saved up some money, and I was going to hitchhike home to Mississippi. And I think this was probably along about in August or September of '42. And in the meantime, I had been corresponding with my parents through mail, and they had received a notice that I had deserted the CCC camp. So they were upset at me. But I decided to hitchhike home, but I didn't tell them I was going to hitchhike home. Well, Irby didn't want to go. He said, going to stay there. So I said, I'm going to go by myself. So this guy, Milton Kemp was his name, that we were living with. Him having driven back and forth from Mississippi to there a few times, he routed me out the old 66 highway. And I forget now what towns I had to change highways until I got on 66 and so forth. And then where I get off of 66, he'd give me a route to go. So I left there on a Wednesday morning, got home on Sunday night, about 9 o'clock at night. I used to remember where I got a ride from, to, and so forth, but I can't remember all of it now. It's been so many years ago.
What happened after that?
But after I got back home, then my dad was really reading me off about now. He said, your draft age is only from 21 now. But he says, if you ever get drafted, they're going to look back and see this record. You deserted from the CCC camps, You're not going to be given any freedom at all. You're going to be drafted in if the war's not over. You're going to be drafted in, but you're going to be just like a prisoner, but you're going to be serving in the military. You won't get any liberty or anything. You scared me up with it. Well, I wanted to go in the Navy, but they said, no, you wait. The war will be over before you get draft age, but if you're going to be drafted, if we won't have to sign for you then. But as long as we're going to have to sign for you, we're not going to sign for you. So a friend of mine that I had gone to high school with had been down to Gulfport, Mississippi, and he'd gotten some recruiting papers for the U.S. Coast Guard. I'd never heard of the Coast Guard. Neither had my parents at that time. But they looked these application papers over, and on that paper it says, list any military experience, do not include CCC. So I showed that to my dad. So they said, well, we'll sign for you. Because they didn't know what the Coast Guard was, but my dad had heard of somebody that knew somebody that was in the Coast Guard. So he began to question around about it. Best he could put together, it was just down at Gulfport, Mississippi. And they was just guarding the coast down at Gulfport. He didn't know any more than that. So they signed for me to go in the Coast Guard. I went in the Coast Guard, but they didn't know it, I didn't know it. But in wartime, the Coast Guard is automatically under the jurisdiction of the Navy. And so after we got through boot camp, I was on port security duty in Jacksonville, Florida for about 7 months, and then was sent to Norfolk, Virginia, and was put into a big company of people, Coast Guards that were being trained for amphibious personnel attack transports. That's where the big transports, Coast Guard got 6 of them in 1943. And these amphibious transports, called attack transports, carried 24 landing barges and 4 tank lighters that could land 1 tank and its crew in each one, and to carry 1,000 troops. So we went through a 6-week training for that prior to going aboard the ship, and I was assigned to the USS Bayfield, PA-33, that meant personnel attack, number 33, and it was a flagship, and it was equipped to carry a Navy admiral and his staff for communications from ship to shore during the Normandy invasion and southern France invasion. And after we went on a shakedown cruise when the ship was commissioned in Brooklyn, New York, and I was assigned to it on November the 16th, 1943, and it was commissioned on November the 20th or 21st. And then we went on a shakedown cruise, and we went from New York to Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, and went on a shakedown cruise there, and then went to New York, picked up some troops, and we went overseas, over into Europe. We unloaded those troops in Glasgow, Scotland. And I remember we left New York, and it used to be, I forget now what dates, Washington and Lincoln's birthday both come in February, but I remember what dates were. We left on one of them's birthday, which come first in February, and the other one, which come second in February, was the day we arrived in Glasgow, Scotland. That's how I remembered it. So we stayed there a few days and went to a place called Clyde, Scotland, the Firth of Clyde, Scotland. Picked up some more troops and took them out on some maneuvers somewhere between there and Plymouth, England. Going through maneuvers just like landing troops. And we took them after the maneuver week, we took them on to Plymouth, England. And from then until June of 1943, or 44 rather, when they had the invasion of Normandy, we was taking troops out of Plymouth, England, get a fresh batch every week. We'd take them out somewhere along the English Channel and go maneuvers, land them just like the real thing. Land all their equipment. I mean, not just one ship, but a whole convoy of ships. Just getting ready for the invasion of Normandy. So we did that until time for the invasion of Normandy. And just prior to the last invasion was something, and incidentally, I've got a video of it that I got through the Bayfield Veterans Group that was released by the Navy that happened just before the invasion of Normandy. It was the final hardening of the troops, they called it, the whole convoy that was going to be invading Normandy. Went out in a place called Slapton Sands. It was on the Scottish side of the English Channel. And we was in convoy and was going to make the landing the next morning at something like 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that, whatever it was. But because of a mix-up, we didn't have enough of escort along with us, just in case something happened. And sure enough, some German U-boats slipped into the English Channel, and that area was known as a hunting ground for the German U-boats. And they slipped into that convoy. They only had 2 destroyers that come out of England that was furnished by the English government, the English Navy. They had 2 destroyers with that group coming out. And one of them had had some trouble and had turned around and went back to Plymouth because of troubles. And the other one didn't have his radio frequency on with the radio on the Bayfield, so they couldn't communicate. Of course, the convoy, I don't know how many miles long it was or how many miles wide it was. But that night, the German U-boats sunk 2 of our ships and badly injured another one. And they got their communications mixed up somehow. There were ships that was already landing their troops on they had completely evacuated that town of Slapton Sands prior to that, because it had been arranged between the English government and the Admiral Halsey's Filth Amphibious Fleet that this was going to be used as a hardening for the troops place. There's going to be landing under fire. The people up there that was representing the Germans was our people, but they had their timing to where there would be fire coming, but the guys wouldn't be coming in until this is so that the guys who was involved in that didn't know but what that was a real thing. It was the same way with us. Every time we went out on maneuvers out of Plymouth, we didn't know but what it was a real thing. We was made to believe that. So, but there was a big mix-up that night. But there's stuff that the English military and the American military both covered it up for a long time because they didn't want that to get out, to be in favor of the Germans, because it wasn't, but it's just another week or 2 until they was ready to go into Normandy.
Yeah.
Well, still we went on into Normandy. We landed our troops on D-Day in Normandy. The flagship had to stay there for communication from ship to shore until the beachhead could be established. There come a typhoon on the Normandy coast. It was the worst one it had had in 45 years, and it lasted 12 days. They knew it was coming because it had already been predicted. That's the reason they set the timing up to try to get the troops in there and get them inland before the typhoon came. But they didn't all get over the hump and in there like they had hoped. The typhoon created a lot of havoc there. There was ships that had already gotten unloaded, and they're being unloaded, they set high out of the water. Breakers was coming in off of the English Channel 40 feet high. And they got those ships that was unloaded, got them broadsided, the big waves catch them and then broadsided against it, set them up on the shore, and when that one washed out, the ship turned over on its side. Next would come in and lifted it a little bit and set it a little further in. after that, it lasted 12 days. With the flagship, the Bayfield that I was on, we headed out toward the English Channel, dropped both forward anchors, and kept the ship's engines going, keep the screws turning to keep us from dragging anchor. And the ship bobbing up and down, the waves. It would ride up the 40-foot wave, and when the wave got midships, bow of the ship would take a nosedive. The rear end of the ship would come up out of the water, and you could see the screw turning out of the water. And it'd shake the whole ship, and by then it'd take a dive, and the next would wash the whole ship over. I mean, nothing but the superstructure and the mast sticking out of the water. No one could go up topside. That's when they say topside, that means up on the main deck. Everybody had to be down below.
Wow.
So that lasted for 12 days, and after that was over, everything settled down again. When we'd be on watch up on the deck of the ship, take our binoculars and look on the beach. Of course, we was probably a mile or half a mile to a mile out away from, that's as close as the bigger ships could go in, you know. You could look and see ships laying over on their side, all over that Normandy coast as far as you could see. So then we stayed there about 30 some odd days, and we left and went on down to Naples, Italy. And incidentally, this Admiral Moon, Admiral Don Moon, he was a rear admiral, and he was directly under Admiral Halsey, and Admiral Halsey was aboard the battleship Texas. That's where his headquarters was. But this Admiral Moon committed suicide aboard the Bayfield, because on the way down to Naples, Italy, we heard, it was rumored around on the ship, that Admiral Moon had put his .38 revolver in the roof of his mouth, and pulled the trigger and took the back of his head out. And they thought it was stress from the operations that he was in charge of there. So we went on down to Naples, Italy, and they got another admiral to take his place, but they kept Admiral Moon's staff. And this Admiral Lewis took his place. So we went through maneuvers again, taking troops out of Naples, Italy, doing just like we had done for 2.5 months before the invasion of Normandy. Out of Plymouth, England, we was doing the same thing out of Naples, Italy, getting ready for southern France. So we went through southern France invasion. It wasn't as bad as Normandy, but we had to stay there longer. We had to stay there about 45 days. And then we come back from there and went to the United States again, or I should come back to the States, and we went in dry dock in Norfolk, Virginia, and I got a 15-day leave and went home. And when I come back, we picked half of the ship's crew had gotten transferred, but I was in the half that stayed aboard. So I didn't know that till I got back to the ship after my 15-day leave. We went to the Pacific. We went through shuttling troops around for a lot of different islands, taking them out on maneuvers and doing the same thing, getting ready for the invasion of Iwo Jima. So we went through the invasion of Iwo Jima. Flagship stayed there some 30 some odd days after the invasion of Iwo Jima. And then it was a shorter time between the invasion of Iwo Jima and southern France. I don't remember for sure just when, but we did some maneuvering, but mostly moving troops from one place to another. I know we went to a place in the Espiritu Santo Islands, or well, no, in the New Hebrides Island, the main island, Espiritu Santo, in the New Hebrides Island. We went there to pick up some Navy Seabees that had been there building roads and putting in fighter strips. And they were through with their job, and we went there to pick them up, and we took them and their equipment back to Guam. And then we come back, and it was time then for the invasion of Okinawa. So we went through the invasion of Okinawa. But the strategy for Okinawa was that they had been trying to confuse the people that was on the island, the Japs that were on the island, to make them think that they was going to make their landing on one side of the island, but the plan was to go to the other side. So the ships got in convoy, and for 3 days in a row, pretended they was heading in to make an invasion, but then turned the whole convoy turned to go back out to sea again, and that caused them to start drawing all their forces over to protect that side, or to defend that side. And then on the next morning, after the 3 attempts like this, we went around and come in on the other side, and that caught them by surprise. So it took about, I think, month or month and a half, I can't remember how long it was, before we left there. And then we shuttled some troops for a little while, not very long, but we come back to San Francisco in August 1945. And I was transferred, well, I got a leave and went home. And then when I got back to the ship, found out that the original half of the crew that stayed aboard when we come back from Europe, they had got discharged. I mean, not discharged, but transferred off the ship. So I was transferred off the ship then. And that was August 15th, 1945. And from then on until March 46, I was stationed at a separation center in San Francisco, Bay and Powell Street. And it was a place that had belonged to Simmons Mattress Company, but the Coast Guard had got it during World War II and used it as a separation center. Actually, it was like a recruiting place during the war, and then after the war was over, it became a separation center for guys that was waiting to be discharged. And by that time, you could get discharged on the point system, they called it, depending on how many points you had, depending on how long you had to wait. So I had to wait from then until March 46 and got discharged. And I went back to Mississippi then. And I didn't, since I didn't finish high school, I went and took a GED test at Hattiesburg, Mississippi. It was a state college in Mississippi State College in Hattiesburg. I took a GED test and got the equivalent of a high school diploma. And one of my mother's brothers, younger brother, worked for Mississippi Fire Company, and he got me a job with Mississippi Fire Company in Gulfport, Mississippi. And I was supposed to start serving an apprenticeship as a lineman. So I worked, I didn't really go to work there until about May, I think, or June of 46. And by the end of 46, I lost my job, come back to McGee to my parents, and a brother-in-law of mine, he is married to my older sister, had been wanting to go to California, and I'd been wanting to go back to California. He and I decided to go to California. So I had a 41 Oldsmobile car that I had bought after I come back from the coast and back to McGee. I bought it and went to Jackson and bought it. And he and I drove that 41 Oldsmobile to California in January of 47. So there is where I met my first wife, and about March or April of 47, and her and I got married in August of 47. She was from Arkansas. Her dad had gone there to work in the shipyards in World War II. Of course, she had graduated from high school in Arkansas. But then she went to California. She was already 17 years old when she went to California. She graduated from high school and went to California. And so her and I married in August 47. And we had the 2 children. Beverly, the oldest, she was born in September the 8th, 1948. And then Gary was born June the 23rd, 1950. We moved from Richmond, California to San Leandro in 1952. Stayed there in San Leandro until 1968, moved to San Lorenzo, stayed there for a little while and bought a farm in Brentwood. Moved up there, stayed there for 3 years, and come back to Hayward, California, and stayed there in Hayward, California. And my wife died in 1997. And
What was your career while you?
I served an apprenticeship with the Santa Fe Railroad after I went to California. For a short while, I worked at Westinghouse Electric while trying to get hooked up on my apprenticeship with the Santa Fe Railroad. Worked at Westinghouse Electric in Emeryville for about a year and a half. And then I went to Richmond, to the Santa Fe Railroad shop in Richmond is where I served my apprenticeship. From 1948, I think it was in September 48 when I went there, yeah. And finished my apprenticeship in 52, and I worked as a diesel mechanic until 1954, and got bumped because the railroads was losing a lot of guys because they was eliminating a lot of steam locomotives and getting more diesels. And they took more men to maintain the steam locomotives, and they scrapped a lot of steam locomotives. They eliminated a lot of jobs, so the guys with lower seniority was getting bumped out because you had to have seniority to hold the job. So I didn't have enough seniority to hold a job. So I went to work at General Cable Corporation in Emeryville as a maintenance machinist. Worked with them 13 years, and that plant closed down, and I went to work for Kraft General Foods. It wasn't called Kraft then, it was just General Foods in San Leandro on Washington Avenue. And I worked there until I retired in 1987. Retired in 1987 when I was 62. And then it was 1997 when my wife died. And then in 2000 was when I met your aunt, which is now my present perfect wife. So her and I will be married 16 wonderful years next February the 26th. So.
And
Oh, you said I shouldn't involve you.
no, that's fine. What is, like you've described pretty much your life up till now. What is it like? I don't know how to say this without being offensive. What is it like compared to your whole life, like being elderly? If you split it up into 4 parts, how's elderly?
Well, I would say that the last 16 years of my life has been the most blessed, wonderful years of my life. Because now they said this too. My first wife was a wonderful woman, a wonderful wife, and she was a good mother to our children. She was a good Christian woman, and her and I got into church before we got married, because we both had a Christian background. And we talked over our religious beliefs, and we both had the same kind of belief, and we felt convicted that the thing for us to do was to start trying to honor the Lord and do that which He would want all of His created human beings to do. So we stayed in church, we raised our children in church, and the last 10 years of her life, which was the first 10 years of my retirement time, she was going downhill with Alzheimer's disease. And I kept her at home the whole time, but it got to the point that the last 4 years of her life, she was totally bedridden and incontinent, didn't know who she was, where she was, who she was with, didn't recognize me or our children. Just kept on wanting to say, why can't I go back home? Why am I having to stay here? Couldn't understand anything. You couldn't explain anything to her. You couldn't make any sense out of anything to her, but I kept her at home the whole time. And then after, well, as long as, for the last 4 years, I hired a live-in caregiver to help me with her because it was a constant keeping the washing machine and the dryer going all the time. And I wasn't a very good cook, so this live-in caregiver was a wonderful cook, a good housekeeper, a good caregiver. She was a professional caregiver. A young girl from the Fiji island named Ruthie Nakatini. And incidentally, she's still with the family, and she's just like a daughter to me now. I hired her in 1993. And in fact, my daughter tried to adopt her. She was 24 then, so that's been 22 years ago. So that makes her 46 years old now. And so she's never married. And she lived in as our house 5 days a week. She had her weekends off. And I had some rental properties there, and I let her have one of the little one-bedroom cottages as her weekend place. And she still lives on the same property, but not in the same cottage. It's in a different one. But she still lives there and still does caregiver work. But she's over in Marin County now, and she stays over there all week and just comes home on the weekends. And she's a good Christian girl, and her and a lot of the Fiji people that are in the Bay Area there in California, when she was caregiving for my wife, the bus used to come around, was run by the church that these Fiji people belonged to. It was a full Fiji congregation over in Palo Alto. The bus used to come around and pick them up, take them to their church on Sundays, bring them back to their homes or their weekend place. And so it's still the same way. She goes to her church, and my daughter has recently started to going to church with her. So, and there was this pastor, Fiji pastor of that church was supposed to have gotten citizenship for those girls somehow, but there was some that went wrong, and the girls couldn't get citizenship. But even though she worked as a caregiver, and while she was working for me as a caregiver for my wife, she wanted to go to Chabot College and get a certificate in home health care. So I let her go to Chabot College while she was working for me and get her certificate in home health care. And now she's registered with somebody that places these certified home health care givers. If they get without a job, they just call this and they'll place them on another job.
Are you happy with your life, with your experiences, with your?
Very much so. I don't really have any regrets to look back on and say I wish I wouldn't have done certain such.
Or that you wish you maybe would have done such and such?
Well,
Anything
I don't know that I could look back and say I wish I would have done certain such rather than do what I did do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I feel like that. I look at it like this. Back in the days when I was caregiver for my wife, I used to think, I felt like, for a while, I felt like I had a sentence hanging over me, that I was doomed to do this the rest of my life. Because I felt like she probably would outlive me, and I'd be doing that the rest of my life. But I had to just make myself come to the fact that this is the marital vow says, for better or for worse, for sickness or health, or till death do us part. That's the marital vows, and I felt like I had an obligation to stick to my marital vows.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to pray to God every day to give me the grace to go through whatever I had to go through with, every day to go through with it. So then, after Pam and I met, I had always felt like, until I met Pam, I'd always felt like, well, I was 72 years old when my wife died. And I felt I would never get married again because I couldn't get the kind I would want, and I wouldn't want the kind I might get But after I met Pam, I changed my mind. And after her and I had been together and talked a few times, and I found out that she and I both just kind of felt like we needed to get better acquainted. And she had made a statement once when I asked her why there was never a man with her. She said, I had a husband about 30 years ago, and I said, if there's ever another man in my life, the Lord would have to put him there. And I began to think about that. Here I've been feeling like I'd never marry again because I couldn't get the kind I want. Well, here's exactly the kind I want. Now, it's not the kind, but the one I want. And I began to pray that the Lord would let me be the man that He would put in her life. And the Lord answered my prayer. And that's how her and I are together. And that's the reason I say that this last, soon be 16 years, will be the most wonderful life because the responsibility of raising a family is all behind me. All the struggles of working and raising a family, that's all behind me. Been retired, but I don't want to stop doing anything. I just want to keep on, like the old saying, rather die with my boots on. I don't want to just sit back and do nothing.